Clay and I are really delighted that on a Sunday afternoon so many of you would come out to join us here today in our conversation. We had to work really hard. You know, the weather was going to be 60-some degrees. We had to work real hard to get that temperature down, so you weren't out cutting your grass or raking or doing whatever else you would do on a beautiful day. But so it's a little bit cooler today than it was. Yesterday was gorgeous, so a little bit cooler.
Can I just move this a bit? Just try to be calm.
I am.
Yeah. Okay.
Do you know what you're doing?
I do. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Does that sound better?
It does sound better.
Okay. So at any rate, so we're today, and we have a guest with us today, and we'll be introducing her in just a little bit. But here's the first thing that we wanted to do is we've had a number of folks that have been following the recent educational trips that Clay was on, and I was part of that as well, and we had a number of other BSc faculty that were involved in that, and so what I'd like to do is kind of tell you why we were doing that, get everybody caught up on that, and then what we're going to do is kind of back up to some of our former conversations that we had. And what we got to do while we were over in Europe is we got to sort of dig into those topics a little bit more, and so we would like to share with you some of the things that we found while we were over in Europe. And then sort of give you an idea of the vision of why BSc has been over in Europe and what we're doing, and then we'll get into the topic of the day. So there's going to be a lot of topics we're going to be covering. I promise we'll be out of here by at least 7 o'clock tonight to make sure that you can.
But we will talk about the sacred.
But we will talk about the sacred. First, we had a marvelous student visit with faculty over in Rome. Father Jim Shea and I have been working very closely together to strengthen the relationship between the University of Mary and Bismarck State College. And so a couple of months ago, Father Shea called me up and said, you know, the Rome campus is going to be open during the week that you have spring break. So would you be interested in using our campus for that week? So I got a hold of Dr. Janelle Masters, the dean. She's out here someplace, and we talked about it and thought we could. It was a real good opportunity for our students to get to Rome, and we wanted. And so then we discussed how we would put this team together that would take the students over there. And Barb Jurgis, who is here today, teaches art for us. And then, so Janelle said she would talk to her, and then we thought that the students ought to have the experience of having some real classical education to go along with it, so we asked Clay if he would go along. And Clay does these tours all over. In fact, you're going back to the Mediterranean here in a couple months, and we thought it was just a wonderful opportunity for our students to go with Barb and Clay and visit Rome and Florence. And so we did that. We got it all set up. Had a number of students that were interested, and some adults and some other faculty members that went along. So we had a very good visit over there. At Father Shea's invitation and generosity, I went as well. My purpose in going was to take a look at the University of Mary campus so that I understand what this relationship would be. And so I'm very excited about continuing to develop this as an opportunity for Bismarck State students. So we will continue to do that. In the meantime, for about 4 years maybe, I have been working with the German Embassy in Washington, D.C. to identify an institution in Germany that we could have a sister institution relationship. And the German Embassy has been very good in these. We've had a number of correspondence. I've been there twice and have been meeting with the cultural attaché. And as it turns out, we were just in the process of identifying what institution in Germany we would visit eventually at about the same time that Father Shea made his offer to Bismarck State for us to use their campus. So what we thought very quickly is that we could accomplish two things in one trip, and that's why it ended up being a rather long trip, but we decided we could accomplish two things. Now, the vision of why we would want to do this is really twofold. One, I think everybody understands that we're in a global village, if you will. Our students need to know and understand the global world that they're going to be competing in. Students that graduate from Bismarck State are not now just competing with students that graduate from Wahpeton or someplace in South Dakota. They're competing in a global world. And so what we're trying to do is establish some international relationships that would then help our students get ready for this world that they're going to be competing in. I've traveled to Africa. We've got an institution there that's interested in working with us. We've got an institution in the Czech Republic right now that's interested in working with us. So now, through the German embassy, we had identified an institution in Germany that would possibly be interested in working with us. So because we were taking a trip over to Rome, we thought, well, then we can accomplish two things. We can turn that into a trip up to Germany as well. So we did that. So we took a team, and besides that, 3 members of the team were already in Europe. So it made it real easy just to make a jaunt up to Germany then to accomplish 2 things in one visit. So that's what we did. I had very successful visits. I think the visit to Rome was outstanding. My hat's off to Father Shea for developing that concept and establishing that campus there. And I know our students were exposed to a world that they only had read about and heard teachers talk about in the classrooms, and they got to walk around in ancient Rome, and so that was really exciting. So we've had 2 really wonderful trips. So we're going to talk a little bit about those, because in the meantime, Clay and I want to point out as an administrator, at our own expense, Clay and I did some things. We took a little side trip, if you will, between the Rome and Germany. We took a little side trip, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today as well. So that sort of sets out what we're going to do for a few minutes to get the program started today. But I know that Clay has a personal note that he wants to talk about today as well.
And first of all, welcome, and thanks everybody for coming out on this Sunday. It's kind of a special one to us because we have a special guest, Dr. Barrett of the University of Mary. And we're talking about a theme that's very interesting to us, and I know to you. But I want to say just a few words about our trip first. And one is to publicly thank Barb Jurgis. She's the teacher of record for this trip that we took. She's an art professor here at BSC, and we had about 12 students. And we went, thanks to Father Shea, we had some exclusive time in the Sistine Chapel. Just 17 of us, all alone in the Sistine Chapel for more than an hour, which is shocking if you've ever been to the Sistine Chapel to have a chance to be there alone. And we went to the Borghese Gallery, where we saw 5 of the greatest statues of the Italian Baroque sculptor Bernini. We went to Florence and saw the David. We had seen Bernini's David in the Borghese Gallery. We saw Michelangelo's David in Florence. We went to ancient Rome, pagan Rome, for a day. We had wonderful guides in Rome who really knew what they were talking about. Plus we had North Dakotans who are studying for the priesthood in Rome who helped us along. And one of them is Robert Shea, the younger brother of Father Shea, the president of the University of Mary. So everywhere we went, we had these really remarkable teachers. But here's what struck me about what Barb Jurgis does. Her students, we would be someplace and she would say, now remember what we talked about in class about the difference between the Baroque and the classical. And you'd see them nodding. You know, like they actually had, they understood it, and she didn't have to re-lecture because the prep work she had done had made them, had given them the eyes to see the things that they were seeing. And that is such an extraordinary basis for going to Rome. So I just wanted to thank her for her good will and the way that she had prepared the students. The students were terrific, and one of the things that struck me, well, first of all, there were, I think, 12 students and then some adults, some full adults, but 5 of the students had never been on an airplane ever. Never. Not even in this country. And so their first airplane excursion is across the Atlantic Ocean, and Several of them had never been on a train, several of them had never been on a trolley, several had never been in a taxi, certainly they hadn't been to Rome. And to watch their eyes over the course of the week as they awakened to the glories of high European culture was really, really amazing. And I believe it's the case that they will never quite be the same, that their lives will be, they'll have a different lens that they will wear thanks to the work that Barb Jurgis done. They all were so appreciated your coming over, Larry. And let me just say of this that Larry came a few days later because he had a pressing administrative work here, and he arrived at dawn. You know, you fly one day and you arrive at dawn the next, and he was picked up at the Rome airport and brought to this convent where we were staying. And I could see that you really only had one desire left in the world, and that was a shower and a nap.
That was pretty good, yeah.
And Barb Jurgis said, nope, you're getting on the bus. And we hauled you around Rome that whole day, and you were glad that happened.
It was delightful.
So anyway, it was just terrific. So now if I can just quickly move in a somewhat different direction for a moment. By the way, this is us in St. Peter's Square. That's Robert Shea, the younger brother of Father Shea there. This is Katie, she works at the University of Mary as the liaison for the UMary Rome program, and then these are students and others who are traveling with us. This is Father Gino, who was giving us an introduction to St. Peter's Square. And we did have an audience with the Pope, and that was pretty extraordinary. The Pope spoke in 7 languages to the assembled multitude. Think of that. That's a well-educated church. But I wanted to talk just a little for a moment, if you would indulge me, about the death this week of my friend Patty Perry. Some of you know of Patty Perry. Some of you met Patty Perry. I have to say, Larry, she was one of the most extraordinary people that I ever knew in my whole life. She died here in Bismarck at Med Center 1 in the ICU. She had massive blood clots. She was one of those people who took care of everybody else and then didn't really take care of herself. She was the director, she was the mayor of Marmarth for many years. She was the president of the Marmarth Historical Society, which, by the way, she called the Marmarth Hysterical Society. She created an EMT program for Slope County, and she was the director of it. She traveled the world. She brought the Cornerstone Theater Company out from New York, and they did Hamlet in the Mystic Theater in Marmarth, and they did King Lear, and the Oresteia, Aeschylus's Oresteia in the Mystic Theater in Marmarth. She was a goat dairy operator and a gardener, and there was nothing that Patty Perry couldn't do, but she couldn't beat this blood clot. And here's a picture of her. It's not a very good picture. She hated to be photographed, and believe me, when she hated something, you listened. Here she is smoking, unfortunately, which she did all day, every day. This is Marmarth. This is the depot. That one of the projects of the Historical Society is to restore that. You see it's in its preliminary phases. This is, for me, Marmarth has a very special personal history, because when I was 25 years old or so, Ev Albers, the director of the North Dakota Humanities Council, picked me up at the airport when I was coming back from several years in England, and he said, "What would you like to do?" And I said, "I want to do humanities programs in Marmarth." And he said, "Where's Marmarth?" And I said, "Come with me." So we drove down, and we arrived in town, and they have this Mystic Theater there, this restored vaudeville theater, and we asked if we could see it, and the people in the bar said, "Well, you got to call Patty." So we called Patty Perry. We'd never met her. She came down, and on the basis of that, we set up this program, a program called What is Marmarth Good For Anyway? And a series of public lectures, and we showed the film Northern Lights, and then we did Chautauqua in Marmarth, and we wound up doing tent Chautauqua in Marmarth 3 times under my watch, and I think 5 altogether. And then this is a historical picture of Marmarth, looks about the same today. Here's Patty. It's a photograph I took off of her Facebook site this morning. In 1980, I hiked the whole Little Missouri River from Devil's Tower to the north unit of Theodore Roosevelt National Park. And my mother took this photograph, Larry. When she took this is near Devil's Tower, and when she took this, she said she realized that she would never see me again. And that I was walking into death. And so I walked all the way from Devil's Tower to Alzada, Montana, and past the Black Hills, and I finally arrived in Marmarth. And by the time I got to Marmarth, this pack, had worn a very serious wound into my back. It was about an inch deep, and it was virtually at the bone. And so I got to Marmarth. I'll read a passage about this from my book here in a minute, but I got to Marmarth, and I knew Patty, and I went to her house, and she nursed me back to health over a period of a couple days. So if you'll indulge me, I just want to read this. I wrote a whole book about Patty Perry. She's the hero of this book. But I just want to read this one passage from that experience. So I stopped at her house. Marmarth was never so much like an oasis as it was at that moment. A couple of hours later, I tramped up the dirt streets and found my way to the Perry residence, a refugee of the river wars, dropped my pack onto the ground and opened the screen door. Patty was in the kitchen, cooking. "Well, I bet you won't ask me today where I'd choose to live if it weren't in Marmarth," she said as she carefully shaped dinner rolls and notched them precisely into a bread pan. "Looks as if you've lived to tell your story." "That's far from clear," I said. "I've got at least 300 miles to go, and I'm just starting to move into the Badlands." Patty: "Why anyone would want to walk that poor excuse for a river, I don't know. Have you ever heard of an animal called the horse?" I sat down and let her start pouring me endless cups of coffee, and she rustled up some lunch. An hour or so later, when it could no longer seem that I was whining or dwelling on my troubles, I asked her if she would take a look at the sore on my back. I lifted my shirt and bent over slightly to give her easy access to the wound. "Jesus, this is a serious problem," she said. "This is the kind of thing a guy like you would probably see a doctor about." I asked her what she would recommend. "Well, I'd keep your damn pack off your back for a few days, that's for sure. Maybe haul a few less books next time." She laughed wickedly. "There's a pretty good discharge, and I think probably quite a bit of infection. At least there aren't any maggots vacationing in there yet, so far as I can see. I'll find some disinfectant, and when we go to milk the goats, I'll get some goat balm to spread over the sore." I took one of the longest and most satisfying showers of my life. The Perry's bathroom is a bit quirky. Above the toilet paper dispenser, for example, is a red plastic embossed label that says, "Warning, do not exceed 250 RPMs. I shaved off my month-old beard, changed into fresh clothes that I had weeks earlier cashed with the Perrys, called my mother, and returned to the kitchen. Patty sat me down, dressed my wound. I tried not to grimace. She had, while I was showering, driven up herself to the barn to get the goat balm. She covered the whole business with a loose bandage, not wanting to keep the healing oxygen from the wound. She was a surprisingly tender woman for all that toughness. So I spent those days with her. Well, then I went back up on the river, and a few years later got married, and when I got married on Pretty Butte, which she, and I'm quoting, "When I told her I wanted to get married on the top of Pretty Butte, she said this: 'There are two types of stupid. There's stupid, and there's you.'" But she presided over all of that. And so anyway, she has been just a remarkable part of my life. This is her husband, Gary. He survives her. This is when I walked the Little Missouri River 5 years ago. My friend Melanie Carvel drove me down to Marmarth. We had a marvelous meal with the Perrys, and then they drove us over to the bridge at Marmarth for me to go on this hike all the way up to the North Unit, 173 miles. And Patty and Gary are there. Melanie's taking this picture. Patty came up and hugged me goodbye, and during the hug, she smoked the whole time. But then she said, and I quote, remember that hot summer, she said, "Just want you to know, the rattlesnakes are shedding their skins early this year, and when they do that, they're blind and really ornery. Have a good trip." And then I walked off. And here I am walking alone up to the river at about 7 p.m. on the last day of July 1986, I think. But Patty Perry was just so central to my life, I can't even imagine it. You know, this is a journal that I wrote that first summer when I was there. I won't quote it. This is my idea of a sacred place. This is near Camp Crook, South Dakota. Comes in that same journal. But let me just say this much more about Patty. She was, Lauren Donovan said this on Facebook the other day, Patty was as tough as a rail spike. And we had this pact that when I died, and it was universally assumed that I would die first, even though she's 10 years older than I am, that she would bury me on the north face of Pretty Butte. This was going to involve many crimes, but she agreed to do it. And Patty is one of those people that you know in your life that you think of as immortal. You know what I mean? I mean, they never grow any older. They're invariably the same. I've known her for 30 years, and she always was the same person. And I just assumed she'd live to be 250 years old. And it really upsets me that she died. And if I had been, and I told this to Gary when I talked to him on the phone yesterday, I said, if I had been in the ICU in Bismarck with blood clots, she would have barged through the door, and she would have come into the room and said, get your ass out of bed and get up. And I wanted so much to do that, but the nurses were not as eager for me to do that but Patty would have found a way. And it reminded me a little bit of what someone said when Theodore Roosevelt died. You know, he died in his sleep, and the Vice President of the United States said, it's lucky death caught him sleeping, because if he had been awake, there would have been a fight. And that's exactly how I feel about Patty Perry. So I'm just going to miss her so much. I can't even imagine a world without Patty Perry in it, but there you go.
Well, our condolences to you. I know you were great friends, and to her family, I know. What, 2 daughters?
She has 2 daughters. She's survived by 2 daughters, Heidi and Haley. Haley lives in Marmarth and has two children, and Heidi lives near St. Anthony, south of Dickinson, and has 1, her son Zane. I've known all of them, watched them grow up. Gary and her good friend Jim survive and are going to stay in the house. And life goes on in Marmarth.
Life goes on. Okay. All right. Thank you.
So now let me thank you for indulging me in that. Going back to our trip, you know, we had the Rome trip, and that was strictly educational. And then we had the Germany trip, which was to create this bilateral connection that you're going to talk a little bit more about and that you've already mentioned, but to create a sister community, and preferably one close to the home of Otto von Bismarck. Because one of your goals, I know, is to remind the people of North Dakota that the city of Bismarck is named for Otto von Bismarck, and that's kind of a big deal. And so you were looking for a sister institution that was close to his boyhood home at Schönhausen, right?
Right.
That's why these 2 places were chosen. So you have 1 week in Rome, 5 days in Germany, and then between, I think this was your idea, that we would rent a car in Rome, mistake number 1, and we would drive to Milan, and then we were going to trace, I don't know if you were here for the thing we did on Mussolini about 2 years ago, but we would then trace the last journey of Mussolini, and he was trying to get out of the country. Hitler was dead, the war was lost, the Allies were approaching Milan, and he was going to try to escape out of northern Italy into Switzerland, where he reckoned he would be protected. And he said goodbye to his wife, who was still in Milan, his wife Rachel, and his children, and then he tried to escape in a convoy of German vehicles that were heading up over the pass, Bremer Pass, and he was with his mistress, Claretta Petacci. They were in separate vehicles, and they got caught. And so we then gave this talk about this, and we thought it would be fun to trace that last journey, right?
Yeah. We were looking specifically, we wanted to find out what did the area look like where Mussolini was captured, where he was interrogated by the partisans, where he was executed, and then the plaza where he and Claretta were strung up.
This is a horrible photograph, but this is the photograph of when the partisans strung up Benito Mussolini and his mistress Claretta Petacci, who chose to die with him. She could have escaped probably, and a number of others, in a public square in the city of Milan. So I had printed this out and laminated it, and we used this as the basis of our search. So these are the days, 27 and 28, 1945. Here he is. This is the rental car. Here's the route. This is, if you know northern Italy, here's Milan. This is Lake Como, one of the most beautiful vacationing resorts in Europe. And our journey was basically to go from Milan up this road to Dongo. And can you just say a little bit about the roads, Larry?
Well, the roads are very narrow.
We drove, in the course of these 2 weeks, we drove about 1,500 kilometers. I drove 1 kilometer, and you drove 1,499 kilometers.
Right. Well, I wanted us to get there safely.
Yeah. And the roads were so narrow that there were times when I literally assumed that we would lose the mirrors on both sides as you zipped along. So here are the places. This is where he was eventually strung up. Here's where he was arrested in a place called Dongo. And here's where he and Claretta were shot. And so our goal was to find all those places, right?
Yep.
Here's Larry
Yep.
in Dongo. This is the city commune or hall in the village of Dongo. And we had just arrived. This is the librarian and a random woman who spoke English. We found in the library, and we asked them questions, and they agreed to help us.
Yeah. Everybody we stopped and asked directions, we would say, we're looking for something about Mussolini. And we would say Mussolini. And nobody was understanding what we were saying. And then Clay had an article with him, and it had Mussolini's name. And so Clay then would point at it, and they'd go, oh, Mussolini. And it's like somehow we had the accent wrong. Nobody understood what
I
we
don't
were
suppose
saying.
they were, when Larry comes up as a mere American tourist, I don't think the first word they expected to come out of your mouth was Mussolini.
Probably not.
So anyway, these two agreed to help us. Here's Larry looking over the map of they had a binder of all of this. Here's Larry looking over they had a binder filled with articles about the last days of Mussolini. And here's what's so interesting. We gave this talk here a couple of years ago. Now we're on this kind of pathetic romantic journey in search of these last days. And they told us that they're planning a museum to commemorate the last days of Mussolini. So we offered our services as consultants. They have not responded to our calls. Here's Larry. Now, he's arrested, and he and his mistress are interrogated in separate rooms of this town hall.
Mussolini, not Larry.
Let me start over.
Yeah, start that sentence all over.
Benito Mussolini, the vicious dictator, and his lovely mistress, Claretta Petacci, were interrogated in separate rooms in this town hall. And it's all shut up. It's completely dilapidated and shut up. And so they were trying to arrange for a visit the next day. We didn't have time for that. So eventually the librarian pulls a key set out of her pocket and opens the door. And so we're now on a balcony looking down in the room where Mussolini was interrogated, but there are no lights. And so you tried to pry open the window. This is Larry prying open the window, which we eventually decided was not a good idea. And then we took flash pictures. This is taken into total darkness, a flash picture from the balcony. And this is the table the place where Mussolini was interrogated. But we can't see a thing except through our cameras. Here's the ceiling that they told us was splendid, and it is. Again, we didn't see it. Now this is right outside the Dongo City Hall, and we reckon that where this crosswalk is where the partisans, these are Italian nationalists who hate Mussolini, many of them communists, but all of them nationalists. This is where the road was much narrower in 1945, unpaved, and they felled a couple of trees to create a roadblock, and that's where they stopped the convoy and recognized him. He was dressed as a German soldier with a helmet over his head and a bandage. And they recognized him and arrested him right there. This is Larry now at the site I'll take you back just quickly to the other map. So he's arrested here and interrogated, and then they're brought the next day to Menaggio, and it's there that they were executed by these partisans. They were on their way to Milan, and they just decided to get it over with. And so this is the spot. There's the marker. There's a nondescript little marker on this road. It took us several hours to find this. And here's Larry standing in front of this marker. So that's the entire monument in the nation of Italy to the death of Benito Mussolini. Do you have anything else to say about that?
No, I think we're doing fine.
You were a lot more eager for this when we were cooking it up.
Well, you're doing good.
This is Lake Como. This is the same spot where the arrest was made. It's fabulously beautiful. This is where we wound up staying the night there at a shabby little hotel. Here it is in the night. It was off season, so it was inexpensive, but it was most beautiful. And this then after they'd killed Mussolini and his mistress and her brother and a few others, they hauled them down into Milan, which is a major Italian city and one of the places where Mussolini had gotten his start, and they strung them up in this plaza, in a public plaza. So we went in search of it, the Piazza Loreto. Here it is. It was disappointing because we had thought that we would recognize a structure or there would be a sign of some sort. There's neither. This is the plaza. Most of the buildings new. I took this just because someone is strung up. It's as close as we could get, you know. I think this is probably the building where it occurred, but most of the buildings have been demolished and replaced. And then again, this is the end of the life of the dictator Mussolini. Mm-hmm. So we couldn't find the sign, so we tried to...
Clay made a sign.
We thought we'd fake you out. If we took a picture of this, you'd think it was a street sign, but Larry objected. So, look, there's even an image. Just what they're planning for Medora.
Yeah.
So that was one program that we suddenly were doing follow-up work on. And you have to say a few words about the Mussolini trip, because I know you found it very charming.
Well, it was incredible, and it was, you know, we're historians, and it was just really remarkable, particularly, I think, the find of the room. We really didn't know that we were going to be that fortunate to find folks, and they were incredibly helpful to us. When we were explaining to them, we finally got across to them what we were looking for, and to be able to be brought into that room and know that 60 years ago or thereabouts that Mussolini was in that room and being interrogated, and so it was quite moving. I'm glad we found everything. The only thing we didn't find was the house there in between where they were shot and where they were interrogated. They were held for a night in a private residence that was in between those 2 points. And we stopped in that little town, and we couldn't. The one problem is everybody there was 30 and below, and probably not familiar with their own history, I'm going to guess, because we couldn't get
If we'd had more time, we would have found it.
If we'd had more time, we probably would have found it. We would have found City Hall or something like that. But it was extraordinary.
And I'd just say this much, as Larry said, this trip between Rome and Germany was not done at any public expense. We paid for this ourselves, and it was almost obscenely expensive. And at one point I said to Larry, if I take 4 photographs, that's $250 a pop on this ridiculous trip. I mean, who else would go on discretionary time to follow the last days of a dictator in northern Italy?
Yeah, well, it was good. And people complain about the price of gas here. Try filling up a gas tank there. It was incredible. $95 it cost me for half a tank of gas.
$16 a gallon.
It's amazing.
So then we went to, this is East and West Germany. Of course, the reunification occurred in 1990. And so this was the former GDR, East Germany. Here's where we went. We went to, you can see them better than I can. We went to Magdeburg, which is an ancient city. In fact, Otto I is buried there, dating back to the 10th century. And the second city is Stendal. They're both on the western side of the former GDR. And I don't know about you, Larry, but I wasn't thinking about our Cold War talk when we went there. I was just assuming we were going to German universities. Weren't you surprised?
We were driving along the Autobahn, and I think it was one of the faculty, Sherry, I think, Omled, who was a part of our team, and she looked over as we're driving along, and she said, that looks like a guard tower. There was this big guard tower that obviously they've preserved at this one location, and it didn't strike me until that point that I think she's right. That is a guard tower, and we have just crossed what used to be called the Iron Curtain, and we just crossed that point. And it was amazing. You've got some of the city shots.
It's night and day visually. I mean, West Germany is bustling. It's Europe's major economy. They've moved into green industry in a huge way. there's energy and vibrancy, and everything is as well painted and tidy as you can possibly imagine human communities being. And then after you cross that imaginary line and move into the former GDR, things get a little shabbier, a little less well kept, and you see the lingering. And we had wonderful conversations with our hosts about this, and they said that even though reunification occurred 20 years ago now, and the German nation pours 58 billion marks per annum into the East, it is still far from equalized, and many people perceive that as money lost.
A friend of mine that I taught with down in New Mexico lives in Frankfurt now, and we got to visit with him for a bit. So he's on the west side, and he was talking about this, that they were told initially, the communities were told that they would pay for a couple of years for this reunification. They would receive this special tax. 20 years later, they're still paying that tax for the reunification. To prop up the East. And so many problems that I had no anticipation
and
of seeing.
The faculty and the staff of Magdeburg, of the university that we were visiting, couldn't have been more generous to us in every possible way. They kept saying January 16th, 1945, and that was the day that the West, the Allies, bombed Magdeburg. It wasn't us, thank goodness, it was the Royal Air Force, the British. They utterly devastated the city. Here, just give you a couple of quick pictures. This is the fruits of Nazism. This is Magdeburg in the spring of 1945. Here's another. The city was destroyed, or large sections of it were destroyed. And of course, where cities are destroyed, there's a massive rebuilding project, and the rebuilding project came under the GDR. These buildings, this is the campus of the school in Magdeburg. These buildings were actually built by Hitler. These are Nazi barracks in Magdeburg that were built by the Nazis, and they survived the war, and now they're the home of this university, and they've obviously cleaned them up. In fact, they won an award as, I think, the second or first, the second most beautiful university campus in Germany last year. So the entire school exists within these former Nazi places. Here is a typical sort of East German scene, broad street, no traffic, giant buildings. Again, this is that sort of monumental, almost Stalin-esque.
Actually, if you'd back up a second,
sir.
Clay,
this is not bombed here.
Well, what we're seeing here is what the German architecture looked like. This is a part of the city that was not bombed. And then the next scene.
This is the replacement.
This is the replacements that the Soviets put up, and you can see it's really stark, the difference in these.
Then in Stendal, where the lesser of two campuses is, it's a two-campus institution. This is one of the buildings that hasn't been restored. They've poured all these billions of marks and euros into this campaign to rehabilitate Eastern Germany, and they're doing it on a building-by-building basis. In America, we'd be more likely to bulldoze and start over, but now Germany is trying to preserve this. So this building is slated for reconstruction, but at the moment it's just this kind of broken-down shell. So enough. So that, in some sense, ties our trip to Europe.
The only thing you didn't put in there is anything about Schönhausen. So
we went.
Very
I didn't put in, but I brought you a gift.
Oh no!
So we went to Schönhausen,
the birthplace of Otto von Bismarck.
And so here was our idea. We thought, this is Larry. No, I'm giving you credit.
Thanks.
This is not a setup.
It is a setup.
Okay, then I'm taking it back. I thought what we wanted to do was to put Bismarck back in Bismarck, to put Otto von Bismarck back in Bismarck, so that we live in a place called Bismarck, and you had just had a conversation with somebody who said, oh, I didn't know it was named for Otto von Bismarck. So our goal is to create a contextualization of the name of Bismarck in the city of Bismarck, and so that was the sister city thing. And we thought, somewhat naively, that all German people would admire Otto von Bismarck the way, say, we admire George Washington. But that's not what we found.
No, we found him a little edgy about the old man. He had passed anti-Catholic laws, so that didn't endear him to much of the population. And they just saw him as more of a tyrant.
Like a militarist and a 19th century reactionary and an advocate of the Junker class, the landlord class. And so they were less enthusiastic about our connection than we were.
We were very enthusiastic to get over there to talk about Bismarck and found out. Now, there were some people. We met a Frau von Bismarck that's
Descendant.
reconstructing one of the buildings in that area. And there's a group there that's planning the bicentennial. In 2015, it'll be the bicentennial of Bismarck's birth. So that's going on. So there's some activity going on. But when you're at the university, particularly with the faculty and folks from the university, they were much more edgy about Bismarck.
And so there are 30 statues at least of Otto von Bismarck in Germany.
I know it's in your.
And one of our goals is to create a statue of Otto von Bismarck here in Bismarck, North Dakota. It strikes me as crazy that we would be Bismarck,
right,
and have no statue of Bismarck. And there are 30 statues of Bismarck in Germany, and when we learned that they don't really like him anymore, we thought, hey, just give us one. But they did not agree to that.
Yeah.
Not yet, but I think there's some promise here.
We can work on
They
that.
melted down Marx and Lenin
Yeah.
after the reunification, so maybe we can get ourselves a kind of an eBay Bismarck.
Yep.
But we came back a little, what'd you say, crestfallen about the prospect of a statue in the short term.
I wouldn't say crestfallen, not as optimistic as when we went.
I think that's all over, actually. But I brought you a gift because I know that you don't want to give up on this dream. And so I bought you a statue of Otto von Bismarck to put on the campus of Bismarck State.
Thank you, Clay.
See?
That's very nice.
Yeah.
So we now have Otto.
Now you can say that you have erected a statue of Otto von Bismarck here.
Thank you, Clay. That's very kind of you. Okay, so now we're going to get to the topic that we're going to. Some administrative notes. April 22nd is our last conversation
Of this year.
Patrick Atkinson will be here to talk about human trafficking. I'm sure you know, many of you know that in addition to the God's Child Project, Patrick has been very active in the institution on human trafficking that he has set up, and has been a consultant to the State Department on this issue. So he will be here with us on the 22nd to talk about human trafficking. So now we're going to move on. Okay, so I'm going to move over here, Carol. I'm going to slide over. Carol Barrett is the Associate Professor of American Indian Studies at the University of Mary in Bismarck. Dr. Barrett has received several Larry Remley Memorial Fellowships from the North Dakota Humanities Council. Her interest in early reservation life among the Lakota has led to research and public programs about North Dakota Indians and Wild West shows, a pictographic account of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, a biographical exploration of Sitting Bull's nephew, One Bull, and other topics relating to the impact of reservation life on the Standing Rock Sioux. Barrett studied English literature and American Indian studies at St. Louis University, Marquette University, the University of Wyoming. You're going to have to read that one to me. Oh, I'm glad you said that. University. Her PhD from the University of North Dakota is entitled Into the Light of Christian Civilization, St. Elizabeth's Boarding School for Indian Children, 1886 to 1967. The dissertation uses oral interviews and archival sources to develop a history of an Episcopal boarding school located on the Standing Rock Reservation. So please welcome Dr. Barrett. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Barrett, for being here. Let me just start. I wanted to start by creating at least a little framework so you can work against it. And what do we even mean by the sacred? So I have at least three categories to get us started. One notion of the sacred is places we invest with meaning. And we saw those on this trip. I'll come to that in a minute. The second one are shrines, where something happened. You could say, in another era, Mussolini's death spot would become a shrine. Or there are shrines, and I'll show a couple of those in a moment too. And then there are third, this is where Native American spirituality comes in more, but places that invite being sacred, that are sacred, that humans only recognize their sacredness. They're not invested with sacredness the way you might plop down a shrine or plop down a church. It's as if the place itself says, or is sacred, and invites humans to understand that, to hear that. So I just wanted to create those. Here's a place where we have invested spirituality. You know, I don't know how they cited the Assumption Abbey at Richardson, but I'm doubting that that people were doing it in some sort of an intuitive way. They decided to place it there, they found land, they built it, and then it becomes a sacred place because of the sort of meaning and construction that is created there. So that's a classic example of investing a place with spirituality. And Lauren Donovan, by the way, has a really good new book on the churches of North Dakota, the rural churches. And in each case, somebody said, I'm a farmer, I'll give you this land, and you can build this church on it. And that's how these places became invested with spirituality. Here's a place that is a shrine. This is the Sitting Bull's cabin down on the Grand River, where he was assassinated on December 15th, 1890, and because of that, it has become a sacred place. It is a Sundance site, it's a prayer site, it's a place where Native peoples go, and some non-Natives, and it's invested with meaning, not because it is intuitively a sacred place, but because something so important happened there that it has become a shrine, or it's become a place where other spiritual activities are drawn. And here's a third kind. This is one of my favorites in North Dakota. This is the Medicine Rock down near Leith. I don't know how many of you have been there, but down near Leith, near Flasher, there is a Medicine Rock. And when Lewis and Clark came through in 1804, they were told about it. They did not visit it. When Maximilian came through in 1832, he was told about it and did not visit it. But it has for centuries, maybe forever, been a place that was sacred. And the way that Maximilian and Lewis and Clark tell it is that Native peoples would go there and they would fast and prepare themselves for this, and then they would ask a question the way we might ask a question of the Oracle of Delphi, but they would say, you know, a question of some sort about the meaning of their lives or the meaning of their culture, and then they would go away and sleep ritually, and come back the next day, and there would be some sort of an inscription. There would be markings on the rock that could be interpreted by a holy person, explaining the answer or providing clarification about that question. So how this place, it's now a State Historical Society place near Leith, how this became spiritual is an interesting question. But most Native Americans would say, well, it is sacred, and all we're doing is recognize it and going there, and its sacredness emanates from the ground up. So there are three very different types. This is you might say, artificially invested sacredness, but then it builds over time. Here is a place where something really extraordinary happened that creates its own sacred aura. And then here's a place that most Native Americans, although few whites, would say is inherently sacred. So with that, we turn it to you.
Well, I have nothing to say. I was invited to give stand at a lectern, and I chose not to because it would turn into a long song and dance. So I'm going to try to present some major ideas and then turn it over for conversation, which is, after all, the point of this day. Obviously, what is sacred is elusive, and when we start to discuss sacred place and we begin to bring in American Indian culture, what happens is we have this kind of a dichotomous conversation develops right away, is that American Indian people have total reverence for the land, and they draw profound spiritual meaning from it, whereas non-Native people in the United States are utilitarian, they commodify the land, they look at it as a resource to measure what kinds of economic value it might have, or they look for it for recreation purposes. And I think certainly those of us that live on the Northern Plains, and Clay certainly spoke about sacred places when he was talking about Patty Murray, when he was talking about Patty, and also then in even the sites in Europe and so on. But I think those of us that come from the Northern Plains were surrounded by landscape, and at certain points in our lives, all of us in this room have found a place or a certain landscape that we define as sacred place or a sacred space to us in particular. And that would mean just a place where heaven seems to touch the earth and we find ourselves aware of the holy. It's simply a place where a higher energy seems to reside and we find some peace or solace in that. If we have a sacred place in our own lives, I think it helps us to come to understand on some level that American Indian people's lives were so closely tied to the land, and that still today, in a very contemporary sense, they are drawn to the land in a sacred way and for ceremonies and so on. So I want to talk a little bit about more the traditional way of life, and then very quickly get into more modern day issues. And there was a period of time in which there was that disconnection possibly from the sacred land, or at least an attempt at disconnection. But in the earliest days, Plains Indian people were living off of the land, and they saw it as a harmonious existence. Their lives were tied so closely to the land, to the weather, to the stars, to everything that was on the land. And there was a sense of the universe as a sacred place. The earth is talked about in prayers as mother, and the sky as father. And these aren't simply poetic metaphors, but it was basic to the theology of the people. All animals, plants, winds, rocks, and so on were said to be created by the Great Spirit, and everything in creation then had a purpose for being and had a spirit. There was that connectedness to creation, and among the Plains tribes, the prayers will end in a phrase that would translate as, "We are all related," and that's really the way of saying amen. You know that you're at the end of your prayers when you hear that phrase. And in ritual ceremonies, they always begin with the prayers to the four directions, to the heavens and to the earth. So all around me is holy, all above me is holy, all beneath me is holy. And that underscores that relatedness to all in the universe. And as a land-based religion, that's somewhat different than certainly was pointed out with in Christianity, where we have sacred structures. This weekend at the University of Mary, in fact, there was an exhibit of sacred art, Christian art, I might add, and one of the talks was on sacred architecture. It was about churches and how churches are built and so on, and how we imbue the sacred and the metaphor and symbols that we use in those structures. For the Plains tribes, though, every element of the environment was vital and dynamic, and everything existed in an interrelated and harmonious way. The landscape had physical as well as metaphysical meaning. And in this landscape, everything from very large structures to very minute structures had a place in the life of the people. Black Elk talks about the idea that every little thing is sent for something, and in that thing, there should be happiness and the power to make happy. For the Plains tribes, then, the fixed limits of their world was measured by the circular path of the sun, and they thought that that was the entire universe, and that there was an edge to the universe, so to speak. Certain prominent features of landscape, often hills or buttes or caves, unusual structures were considered especially favorable spots for establishing communion with spiritual forces. So we'll find Bear Butte is considered to be a very holy site. The Pryor Mountains on the Crow Reservation in Montana are likewise sacred areas. These are areas where you find vision questing in particular going on. Chief Mountain, which is part of the Sweetgrass Hills in Montana, are also part of that. Those are all vision questing areas. They were considered to be very powerful, and that the spirits were very present in those places and particularly strong, and could come to a person and give them a vision, very much like Medicine Rock. Plains life was spiritually rich, and those who study Plains Indian life are amazed in many ways at the complexity of the religious belief systems. Most of the tribes were nomadic, and nomadic people tend to have simpler religious structures and so on, because they're on the move a lot, and it's the deep complexity to the Plains Indian religious life was something that continues to amaze those who study it. There were series of events that went on a yearly basis, visiting certain areas, doing certain kinds of rituals and ceremonies. Some of these ceremonies were communal, some were individual sites. people sought to keep a certain balance in the universe, and they did this through their own prayers, individual prayers as well as communal prayers. And there was, that these renew the universe, in other words. There is a real belief that the land is alive, not just in a metaphorical sense. Every particular form of the land has spirit beings imbued in it, and sometimes we can see these or understand them better than others, but even things like rocks are said to have a spiritual presence in them. And all of creation then is considered to be sanctified. And the land is said to provide for the people and provide spiritual meaning for people. Now I'm going to kind of fast forward, that's kind of a very rough basis, to the early reservation era and then into contemporary American Indian life. In the early reservation era, we mark that as beginning in the Northern Plains in 1876. The Battle of the Little Bighorn is this kind of dividing point. After that, the federal government's goal was to reservate American Indian people and contain them on the reservation land base. And so from 1876 on, most of the tribal people were confined to the reservation areas. And once they were confined to these smaller land areas, they certainly lost some of their sacred sites. Some of those sacred sites were no longer open to them. Eventually, these sites were sold. They were no longer part of the reservation. They were no longer part of any kind of Indian lands and so on. The other thing that's happening during the early reservation period then is this imposition of federal Indian policies. And the goal of the federal Indian policies really was assimilation, and it can be summed up in the words of almost every federal document in the latter part of the 19th century, that the goal of the federal government was to Christianize and civilize the savages. And those aren't my words, those come straight out of every document that seemed to have been written during that time. And a lot of changes occurred in reservation life, obviously. And what happens is the imposition of a series of federal Indian policies that sought to divest Indian people of more lands. The idea is that there was a lot of land and not that many people, so there was expendable land, and there was Indian lands were opened up for homesteading and so on. But by 1883, there was a law passed, it's called the Indian Offenses Act. And this forbade the practice of social events that were common among American Indian people. Some of these things would be giveaways and feasts and Indian dancing, what we would consider to be powwow dancing today, as well as religious practices, and these were forbidden. And so sun dances, vision quests, sweat lodge ceremonies, all of these things were forbidden by the Indian Offenses Act. And I can say that a number of these ceremonies continued to be practiced on the reservations. They did go underground. It's easy on the reservations to kind of hide a sweat lodge and so on. For a period of time, there were not sun dances that were openly practiced, and those are very large events that draw a large number of people in. But in all reality, a lot of the songs, the memories, those sorts of things did obtain on the reservations. But in that early reservation period, there were a lot of restrictions on the religious ceremonies as well as travel off the reservation. So these sacred sites were no longer as available to people, and there was a lot of sadness in the fact that these annual rituals could not be done, that people could no longer vision quest and those sorts of things. But again, a lot of this information still stayed alive in stories and in songs and in prayers that people continued to do. By the late 1960s, again making a rather large leap in time, there was a lot of activism on the reservation. You certainly had the American Indian movement coming onto the reservations and pushing for reforms and that kind of thing. But you also found tribal councils and so on pressing for what we call Indian self-determination, that ability to make decisions that would affect Indian people, to run their own school systems, to develop their own systems of government with a lot more teeth in them and so on. And so less involvement of the federal government. And it was during that time on the reservations in the Northern Plains in particular, that there was tremendous revitalization of the traditional religions. You start to see sundances openly practiced, the sweat lodges and the sweat lodge ceremonies, Yuwipi ceremonies, so on and so forth. All of these religious traditions became revitalized. There were also demands for land, return of some lands, return of sacred sites, issues with Devil's Tower, Bear Butte, areas in the Black Hills, so on and so forth. And by 1978, then the federal government passed a law called the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. And this actually just was a law that granted religious freedoms to American Indian people. In part, it says that Indians have the inherent right of freedom to believe, express, and exercise the traditional religions of their people, and including but not limited to access to sites, use and possession of sacred objects, and the freedom to worship through ceremonials and traditional rites. Which sounds very good. In actuality, it didn't provide as much freedom as people had hoped. There still were and are restrictions to land, and those kind of have caused some kinds of irritations with people, certainly in the Northern Plains area. Access to sacred sites is still somewhat limited. Devil's Tower is an area where hiking has seemed to be the predominant kind of call for people that go there, and yet you still have American Indian people attempting to do ceremonial kinds of things there. And hikers have been asked not to do their thing, so to speak, during the month of June, but you have people that still insist that this is their right and this is their church and that kind of thing. So you still do have some butting of heads in many of these sacred areas. The American Indian Religious Freedom Act actually was somewhat restricted. That the idea is that if these sacred sites are on federal lands, state lands, or private lands, Native people don't strictly have access to the sites, and they don't have the right to practice their traditional religion unless they get permission to do so. So those are some of the issues now. I mean, that's really just a quick look at it. Again, the whole notion of sacred places is elusive, and then again, I think every one of us in this room could mention a sacred place to us. So.
That's terrific. Thank you. Let me just ask you a quick question. So take the Medicine Rock at Leith. If the way you were describing Native American cosmology, everything is sacred.
Right.
A rock is sacred, the clouds are sacred, my enemy is sacred, my children are sacred. Everything is sacred, and we have a relational responsibility towards everything.
Yes.
But some places take on a particular sacredness, like, as you said, unusual landforms. And I've got a photograph we'll show in a minute of the Medicine Hole up at the Killdeer Mountains.
Yeah.
Devil's Tower clearly is one of those places that just invites, even non-Indians go there and think something's really remarkable. This is not merely geological.
Yeah.
So how does something, in your sense, how does a place like Medicine Rock, now surrounded by farmland, not Indian at all, but preserved by the State Historical Society, how does it come to be invested with special sacredness?
I think it's inherently sacred. The land is sacred, and people come to find those areas or drawn to those areas and continue to go there for ritual and so on. And luckily, some sites have been preserved. Other sites have been totally destroyed just through people not knowing, for one, or they just become part of people's land and there's no longer any access. So.
When you have, white civilization comes into a state like North Dakota and it lays down a template, the rectangular survey grid system, homesteading patterns, railroads, rights of way, school lands, cities, and so on. And in creating the reservation system, I doubt whether we ever said to any Indian tribe, tell us your sacred places so we can make sure we encompass those. They might be on the reservation, they might be off. And so we've probably inadvertently, that's kind of a hard word to use, but inadvertently we've probably eclipsed or possessed a lot of places that were once regarded as especially significant.
Well, the idea too is that once American Indian people converted to Christianity, and that really was the goal, the federal government did push for Christianization. They did give plats of land to the missionaries and assign missionaries as Indian agents at points in time, but with good intentions, that once Native people became Christian, these sites would no longer be imbued with any particular kind of meaning.
They just become land.
Yeah,
then.
they're just land.
And then of course you also have Lakes Oahe and Sakakawea that inundated lots and lots of places that were sacred. Sacred agricultural plots, burial sites. I mean, if you look at the history of the flooding behind Garrison Dam, we did emergency work to pull the graves and get them up onto high land, and some of them were never
really moved.
And so I mean, you started by saying it's kind of an oversimplification to see whites as instrumental and Indians as inevitably aware of the sacred, but there is a lot of reinforcement of that as you look at our development patterns.
For so long, Native people never had a voice, never granted a voice. That, in particular, federal Indian policy determined what was best, and then people were supposed to move on that pathway. Luckily, they didn't all get on the path, I guess.
Go ahead, Larry.
No, I was just going to argue with your word that this happened inadvertently. I think it happened purposely, because one of the goals, as you've already pointed out, one of the goals of federal Indian policy was to really destroy the Indian religions and make them all Christians. That was a stated purpose, that was funded, that was part of the federal policy. And so it wouldn't be inadvertent if a sacred site was transformed into something else, sold off and farmed or whatever. That would be part of the process.
Right, but I think, okay, I grant you all of that, and I accept that we were trying to de-Indianize Indians of their Indian heritage, and the idea was save the man but destroy the Indian, and that was part of the official educational policy of the United States. But that's horrible, and we now see that we regret some of that, most of that. But it's not inevitably that we went out to destroy sites. We just developed them in our own land patterning system. In other words, we didn't go the way Hitler might have gone or Stalin might have gone to rub out places. We just developed them according to our own template, indifferent to the sacredness that they had under another system.
I don't know if I agree with that.
Well, go ahead.
Do you agree with that?
How overtly hostile were we to sacred sites?
We certainly didn't recognize them as being religious sites, plain and simple. So there was total disregard for them. And that...
Yeah, I would say...
I'm more on Larry's side.
Thank you.
Was the government even aware of these sacred sites?
Yeah, they were aware of some.
Some of them.
The question is, was the government aware of the sacred sites? And
The Black Hills were a sacred site and well known, and the punishment for the Lakota after the Battle of the Little Bighorn was seizure of the Black Hills, and that was intentional, and it was actually, the Supreme Court deemed it an illegal seizure in 1980, but there wouldn't be return of land, just an offer of money. So definitely with the Black Hills, that was a tit for a tat.
How about a site as unique as this one on the street?
Well, as soon as it's outside the boundaries of the reservation, then it's really negligible in terms of Indian people needing access or going to have access to it or whatever. Yeah, the idea is that they really weren't, they were in a period of transition to Christianity.
But, and granting all of that, the fact is that this site, Medicine Rock, is protected. It's not a part of a farm, although it once was, but the State Historical Society went in and said, we would like to protect this place. And it's protected. There's a fence around it. You can see the fence there. And when you go there, and I go there a couple of times a year, there are medicine bundles all over it. So Native people come from all over the country to pray there and to do other reverent things that they recognize as somehow more legitimate at this site than just on some plot of ground somewhere. It's not random. And Devil's Tower is a national park. That gives it considerable protection that it wouldn't have if it weren't a national park.
Right, but Devil's Tower is not a national park because somebody said that's sacred to the Indians.
No, that's a late understanding of the National
Right.
Park Service.
Right.
But now they work hard to make access for Native people. Bear Butte is a state park in South Dakota. It wasn't created as a state park as an act of respect to Indians, but the fact that it is a state park gives Indians some opportunities there that they might not have if it were just on a ranch.
But these two sites, and you've already alluded to this, these two sites, Bear Butte and Devil's Tower, are sites that it doesn't matter what culture you're from, you look at it and you say, this is something unique. And therefore, it has been preserved under our system, and now it's accessible to natives, fortunately, because the system, in this case, inadvertently, probably, ended up preserving a sacred site.
But one of the big issues with Devil's Tower is that it's a premier hiking feature, and American Indian people really regard that as desecration. And there was an attempt by the National Park Service actually to close down hiking and access during the month of June, and there was a legal case, and it was decided in court that they could ask people, inform them that this was, June was a time of a lot of ritual and so on. There would be American Indian people there, but they could not really prevent people from the hiking and mountain climbing that they do during that time.
I've got another question. As the reservations were sold off, and we know from the Dawes Act 1887, the idea was that all heads of family would end up, I think it was 160 acres of land, and then the surplus land was going to be sold off. And that's why reservations today have all those checkerboard patterns around there. Has there been an attempt now in modern times to somehow, through oral traditions, and I hate using this word, but I can't think of any other word to do it, but catalog what the sacred sites are in and around reservations so that there can be some attempt? Like I know that Taos in New Mexico, Richard Nixon actually gave back Blue Lake that was a sacred site. Federal government owned it, and they did a land swap so it could go back to the Taos Indians. But that was identifiable as a sacred site, and they could do that. If there's a catalog of these, and again, I don't know that there is, if there's a catalog of these, is there some way then to start moving those sacred sites back into the hands of tribal governments?
They're not going to do that. That whole situation at Blue Lake is an anomaly, and is mentioned as such. It's the one time where land was actually given back to a tribe. But there's been tremendous resistance on that on the part of state and federal governments and local, individual landholders too, which wouldn't have any real stake in that. But some of these sites are cataloged during the various projects within tribal colleges and so on. They will sometimes gather some of the stories that reside on these, but even on the reservations today, a lot of these sacred sites are part of allotments and those sorts of things. If they are, they're open to the people, but there is not going to be a land swap. In the 1930s, there was this Indian Claims Court, and it was set up if there were any kinds of issues that Native people had with land, loss of lands, and so on, but the only thing that was offered was money and compensation, and that's where the Blue Lake actually winds up being as an oddball kind of a solution.
Go ahead.
No, I'm just listening.
Just listening, okay. You know, one of the things that makes this very, very difficult is that it's really easy to drive around North Dakota and elsewhere around the Great Plains, and we can see the steeples of the churches. You know, there used to be so many of them, and I know many of those are shuttered now because of the depopulation in the rural areas. But when you drive out to Richardton and you see the steeples and you say, this is something that's a sacred site, it's far more difficult to do that with native sacred sites that are, well, it's on the side of that hill. You've got some pictures here probably. You know, it's on the side of that hill someplace. Or
Now let's just look at a couple, and then we can talk. But I'm talking about the sacred sense of our trip. Here's the Pietà. Our students at BSC had the chance to stand in front of Michelangelo's Pietà surely one of the world's greatest pieces of art. It's right in the heart of St. Peter's. It's under glass now because somebody attacked it a few years ago.
With a hammer.
But Michelangelo was 24 years old when he sculpted this. Here is the Tiber River. It's not sacred to the Romans. It's important to the Romans. It's not sacred, but here's a river that is sacred to some of us, the Little Missouri. So think of it. I mean, you're on opposite sides of the world. This is a storied river. But this is a river that has something, even for non-Indians, it has there's an aura about the Little Missouri River that makes us want to protect it. It's one of the reasons why it has wild and scenic river status, and the national grasslands were created there, and they do their best to limit industrial damage to it. Here's Bear Butte. It's an anomaly. It's actually more related to Devil's Tower than it is to the Black Hills, geologically speaking, but it's been an ecumenical prayer and fasting and vision quest site for Native peoples, Cheyenne, Lakota, Crow, many others, Mandan, for years, and it was sort of a demilitarized zone. Indians could come there from all different tribes, even if they were enemies, and they would agree to leave each other alone there. And I've been up, I don't know, 100 times, and every time there are prayer bundles all over. It's just awash in prayer bundles. And there are times of the year when the South Dakota Parks Department tries to limit white access to protect the spiritual activity of the Native peoples who come there, usually in early summer. But now Bear Butte is heavily threatened. Last year it was named number 11 on World Heritage threatened sites. And it's threatened by two things. It's threatened by the Sturgis Bike Rally, and there are giant roadside drinking emporia with parking lots of 5, 10, 15, 20 acres that have sprung up within a few miles of Bear Butte, so that people from all over the world come to Sturgis, and most of them do not come to pay reverence to the Lakota people. And so they built these, and the county zoning people have been completely unwilling to listen to Native concerns about this. I think that's just obscene. You know, that if you've ever been to that part of South Dakota, there are hundreds of thousands of empty acres to build roadside bars on. You do not have to build them within 5 miles of Bear Butte. And now there's oil activity coming there, and so this is going to be even more threatened place. Here's Robert Shea, the younger brother of Father Shea. He was a wonderful host to us. This is, I mean, he's talking about his college, but this is a sacred place, of course, for him. This is, I'm sure Carol knows this is the medicine wheel up in the Bighorn Mountains, one of the great, strange prayer places in the American West. It's up in the heart of the Bighorn Mountains. It's the best preserved medicine wheel in the world. It's filled with mystery and sacredness. It's been largely preserved because it's so remote. St. Peter's, different types of, this is the Writing Rock up near Crosby, also protected by the State Historical Society. In other words, it's a sacred place. It's clear to anyone who goes there. And the State Historical Society has set out to study it, but also to protect it. This is a poem, I won't go through it, but by David Solheim. You can look up about Writing Rock. It's a beautiful poem. Here's Maddie Grinnell. Maddie Grinnell is thought by many to be the last full-blooded Mandan person. Now we don't use those categories much anymore, but at the time, in the 70s when she died, she got national press as being the last full-blooded Mandan. And her burial out near Twin Buttes has created a sacred place there. And Amy Mossett, I don't want to go into details because it's Amy's story and it's not my story, but Amy Mossett, the great Sacagawea scholar, told me that when she was 9 or 10 years old, she went to Maddie Grinnell's funeral out on the prairie out near Twin Buttes, and they were all out there to bury this extraordinary woman who had marched with Martin Luther King in Washington, and Maddie Grinnell was really something. And a sacred thing happened at the burial that no one who was there ever forgot. And so that's a site, the kind you're saying, that should be designated. And especially, one of my biggest concerns, and one of the reasons that I wanted to do this program, Larry, is that as we move into an almost unbelievable industrialization of the northern Great Plains, the pressure on these sites is going to be unprecedentedly difficult to absorb. You know, up till now they've been largely okay because the plains are empty. And so even though they haven't been protected very well, at least they've been allowed to sit there because the plains have been such an empty quarter. Now as we are creating pipelines and wells and storage facilities and new 4-lane roads and depots and you name it, man camps, a lot of this is going to wind up on top of these places, and it's going to be a visual noise factor, even if it doesn't obliterate these spots. And so that's one thing for off the reservation. Off the reservation, I doubt that this conversation is going to occur very much. But and I want Carol to talk about this because you know so much more about it than we do, but on the reservation, there has to be an intense anxiety / debate going on about development. Because if you believe that everything is my relation, then when Indians decide whether they're going to put in an oil field or they're going to put in a waste depot or whatever it is, they almost invariably have a conversation in which they say, should we do this? Whose ox is gored? How important is this place? Is it good for the community? They ask questions that white people seldom ask about development. And yet now this oil rush has come so dramatically and so emphatically to the reservation that I wonder how those conversations are taking place.
Well, there is a lot of controversy. In the 1970s, 1980s, there was coal in Montana. And the Northern Cheyenne and Crow reservations both have fairly large coal deposits. And there was quite a bit of discussion there. And the older people said that that coal will be there and there's no reason to extract it right now, as you need to think about this before you go digging into Mother Earth and so on. And some of the tribes seem to grasp at the idea of the resources and so on in the land, and others take much more of a wait and see attitude towards that. Certainly at Fort Berthold, there's been a fair amount of development on and off Indian land. And again, you get it will be within the boundaries of the reservation, but oftentimes it's not Indian-owned land too because of the Dawes Allotment
minerals,
Act.
yeah.
So yeah.
So you're getting, but the pressures must be extreme
Oh,
because
it's extreme.
the basic protocol in an Indian world is to slow things down. Is
Yeah.
to bring the elders in and talk and maybe from a white point of view talk endlessly, but it's to slow it down, to deliberate, to make sure every factor is included, to listen a lot. If someone says, well, my grandfather, that's where he stole the horse that day, then that becomes a factor in whether you develop that piece of land. And white people have a much more streamlined approach to these things. So I worry about what this means for native cultures that are being, they have in front of them the possibility of cash in unprecedented quantities. But they also have a traditional culture that they would like in some ways to preserve in the midst of this.
Well, the federal government also loosened up the laws in terms of these oil leases and coal leases and so on, is that every member of the family that had some kind of ownership rights on the land was supposed to sign the lease agreement, and now they've reduced it to 50% of the people that would have some sort of ownership rights, and that again reduces then the voice of
The
half
caution.
of the family possibly.
Let me just move on a little quickly here. This is Garden of the Gods in Colorado Springs. You know this site well, Larry. It's a sacred site to the Arapaho and to the Cheyenne. It's now one of the most important tourist attractions in Colorado Springs. You have thoughts about that? Nope. Okay. This is my photo of Bear Butte. You can't ever get enough photographs of Bear Butte. Every time you go there, it compels you to get out of your car and take pictures. It's so amazing how it stands alone about 30 miles northeast of the Black Hills, and it just has something that even Devil's Tower doesn't have. This is Devil's Lake, and I want Carol to talk a little bit about that. It's not called Devil's Lake for nothing. Spirit Lake. It's a medicine lake. It's because of its odd dynamics, up and down and larger and smaller, and the storms that come up, and the sometimes alkali, sometimes fresh water. Native peoples have seen it as a medicine-imbued
Yeah.
spot.
And again, like Devil's Tower, Native people make the point that it is misnamed and that Spirit Lake is much closer to it, that it's a place of power and that we ought not to mess with it so much.
Here's the Medicine Hole in the Killdeer Mountains, in South Killdeer Mountain. This one has a double significance. I mean, first of all, there is the fact that it's an unusual landform. It's a cave. It's a limestone cave in western North Dakota that starts at the top of this butte. And so it used to breathe. It's kind of clogged up now, but it's always had kind of an interesting feel to the Mandan, whose land it was, Mandan and Hidatsa. But then there's this legend that during the Battle of Killdeer Mountain, Indians escaped, partly thanks to it, and so it has a double kind of shrine feel. And luckily here, in this case, the ranchers who own it have made it available to visitors. It would be very easy for them to just stick up fences and you go to the house and ask, and maybe they permit you to go and maybe they don't. But they have put up signs saying you are welcome to go up to the medicine hole, and that makes it much more open to a range of people. I just made this little quick list. I was trying to think of places that we know. I mean, Larry said, can we catalog these? These are places we know have medicine. There is the Medicine Hole in Dunn County, and then in northern Dunn County, there's Crow Flies High, which is just west of Newtown. It's an important bluff overlooking the Missouri River. The Writing Rock is up near Crosby or Grenora, Devil's Lake or Spirit Lake, and then the Medicine Rock. There are many, many more, but these are ones that have kind of gone above the radar into the larger community sense of what is a sacred place.
How many is many, many more?
Well, this is a metaphysical question, isn't it, Carol? Because
Yeah.
in the sense, everything is sacred. I mean, if you ask a Native American, where does the sacred stop? They'll say it doesn't, that some places have more meaning than others because there's special things that have happened there or there's special energy there, but that doesn't make a mere tree or a mere rock unsacred. Everything is sacred, and so if you want to, we white people tend to caricature this a little bit, but when Native peoples would go out to kill a bear, they would prepare for it by fasting and having a shaman or a holy person guide them, and then they would go out, and if they killed the bear, then they would pray to the bear and say, I took you, and I didn't take you wantonly, I took you because I wanted your bear claws for this necklace, and I wanted to feed my people, and eventually I will die and go into the earth, and I will sprout grass, and it's sort of what we do at Thanksgiving with grace. At Thanksgiving, we stop and say, let's be mindful of where this food came from, and blah, 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 what we do. That's our way of saying, let's be mindful. And that's really, I think, as good a translation as you can get of what the sacred means to Indians, that in everything we do, let us be mindful. Just take one more, counting coup. We think of it as the sort of act of bravery, but it was an act of special sacredness to touch an enemy live. You can kill anyone you want, but to touch an enemy live and to make your enemy know that you were bold enough to touch him or her, but then to let them live, this is keeping up the relational aspect of respect for everything, even your enemy. And so if you say to a Mandan Indian, what's sacred and what isn't, we want you to catalog it right now, they're going to resist that. But they will say some places are more important than others. Is that fair?
Yeah. That at least there's a need to recognize and preserve certain areas in particular, because they're also citizens of the present century and know that not everything is going to be regarded that way and that they don't have control over everything.
See, that would be important in the discussion that you brought out, Clay, about development.
Right.
I mean, the development that's going on that the state is benefiting from financially and in the 21st century. What we're benefiting from in this development of gas and oil, the issue of where do you put that pipeline, I think is a meaningful conversation, but where is the tripwire as to this place is sacred enough to invest the money to have it avoided, as opposed to, as you said yourself, everything. Well, you're going to put a pipeline. You're going to scar Mother Earth at some point putting the pipelines in. But if, this is the whole thing over the Keystone Pipeline that's going on right now with the Sandhills, which isn't about a sacred site, but about an environmentally vulnerable site. And so can they bring the pipeline down, and then it's going to cost, how many hundreds of millions of dollars more to avoid the Sandhills, and I'm not saying they shouldn't, and I think ultimately they will, and I'll just go on record as saying that the pipeline's going to get built, but they're going to avoid the Sandhills, I think, is what's going to happen ultimately.
Right, so what you're saying is that white people have a protocol for deciding that certain places, for whatever reason, get special weight.
Right.
And that we tend to put it under the Environmental Protection Acts, That's the way we measure these things, but it's also the case, Valerie Naylor is a good friend of mine, the superintendent of Theodore Roosevelt National Park, and she often goes to an oil company and says, I know you have the right to put that derrick there, but I wish you wouldn't, because it's going to impair the beauty of the park and it's too close to the Elkhorn site. And frequently they agree.
Yep.
In other words, we have certain protocols in the non-Indian world to protect some things. We don't do an oil derrick in the heart of Assumption Abbey or in the heart of Bismarck State College campus. We have some restraining mechanisms. I'm sure you want one. But so here's my question for
I would
both
have
of
that
you.
conversation.
Here's my question for both of you. So why do we not accord Native people similar respect? And I hear you saying, how do you choose? But we should be saying, I would think that we should be saying on all development in North Dakota, when we're going to do anything of any significance, we should go to the tribes and say, we're here to listen. Is there anything we need to know?
You know, I'd like to, and I hate to put him on it, did Scott Davis come
I
today?
don't think he's here.
I haven't seen him. Scott Davis is the director of Indian Affairs, and I would be curious if anybody has talked to him.
But I would go
About
first
that.
on all development, on or off the reservation. I would go to have a system in place where we go to the tribes and say, is there anything we need to know? And that's not like you can say this is sacred just because you say it.
Right.
But if you can make the case that there was a place, let's say Maddie Grinnell's grave, and they're going to put a pipeline through it. If the tribe can say, you know, we'd rather that the pipeline not go through here for this reason, that would be weighed. It doesn't have veto power, but it would be weighed. And on the reservation, I would think that would be an automatic show of respect, that there's a different protocol in the Indian community than there would be in the non-Indian community, given the heritage of the place.
But if federal money is involved,
There is a survey whenever there's federal money involved. That's true.
But they also have the right to say that, and this is supported by Supreme Court cases, that they can bypass, that the right of the government to develop sites is more important than the right of American Indian people to worship. And that was in Ling versus the Northwest Cemetery Association, which really limits the American Indian Religious Freedom Act.
But I agree with what you're saying, but I would also say that help happens in development on, you know, if eminent domain, if I don't want them to come through my farm because it's been in my family for 100 years, and the state decides that it's going to come through and put a road there.
Compelling reason.
It's going to do it,
Yeah.
you know.
Here's Bear Butte. I don't know as much about South Dakota, but that's certainly the number one. The Black Hills, generally speaking, are regarded as sacred to a number of nations, and Bear Butte has a particular status in South Dakota. This is the Medicine Rock from near Leith from a larger distance. Maybe we should turn and see if the audience has thoughts. We're running out of time, right?
Yeah, we are starting to run out of time. I'm going to see Robin is in the back. She's got a microphone. I would ask, if you're going to ask a question, that you wait for the microphone, because this is streamed live and as well as being taped, and it doesn't get picked up unless you hold the microphone and talk into it. So are there any questions? And we've covered so many topics today. You can just ask us anything. Anything's open game, okay? We just well have another topic on board too. Do we have any questions on any of the topics?
This one here.
I'm not really sure it's a question as much as a statement, but
Is that on? Okay.
most cultures have sacred elements and sacred places and sacred things. And there's a spot in Wyoming that we all drive through if we're headed to any place in the southwest. Independence Rock, a huge rock that has significance to some people. Devil's Gates, right near there. The Hmong people in California have faced the obstacle of cultural misunderstanding and exactly what you're talking about, in the fact that they came without a country, but with a huge amount of sacredness to the things that they do and their attitudes. So I guess if I try to frame it as a question, don't we have to respect Native American sacred places and any sacred places in order to really accomplish what we're after, and that is to have peace and brotherhood among mankind? I mean, I don't know if there's a way to answer that.
Well, Carol, let me ask it to you in a different way. If we did something like this, if we as a state, our government and our informal protocols of development, if we developed a much more respectful attitude towards native cultures and ask questions more about what's important to you, what are the spots that you most want to protect and so on, how much of a difference would that make in the reconciliation of the two cultures?
Well, I think it would be vast, but I can't see it happening. We can't even get past the Fighting Sioux issue with any sense of conversation.
So you just don't see it? But I mean, what she's saying is, how important is it for us to be able to move forward into a more reconciled Great Plains? Is it essential? Is that, I mean, surely Indians have lots and lots of concerns about their relations with whites, and this is just one of them.
People assert their rights, and they ask to be listened to. They ask to be able to explain things, and so I think it would be, you know, it's good to be listened to, and it's good to be respected, and there's a lot that needs to be done, a lot of work.
Here's one down here. Come on down with the mic. Just
The last statement about California, the truth is that, yeah, that would be the ideal world,
which would?
where everybody would talk to each other and everybody would respect each other, and that would be the ideal world. But I hate to sound like a cynic, you know, the issue right now, which I think is another, it runs parallel to our discussion today, is the terrible shooting of the young African-American young man in Florida now, and they haven't even arrested, apparently, the alleged shooter because of some law that passed 5-6 years ago in Florida. You know, and so that's created another divide in the races now in Florida. Anyway.
I'd like to go.
Oh, you're sounding good.
Oh, I'd like to go back to the Medicine Rock holy place south of Elgin, North Dakota. And if I'm correct, Lewis and Clark were very well aware of that site as a holy place for the Mandan and the Hidatsas, not the Arikara. How could we not be aware of that site then in the development of the grid work, et cetera, and so on, later on in the 1800s? How could we not be aware of it if Lewis and Clark documented that site in 1805? That's my first question. Second question, not a question so much, but a couple of weeks ago we visited the Medicine Rock State Park in Montana, right north of Ekalaka. And if you haven't been there, you need to go there, period. Thank you.
Well, it goes back to what Dr. Barrett was saying. I think that the official policy of white America in the late 19th century was to obliterate Indianness. Not genocidal necessarily, but to obliterate the Indianness of Indians, to make them, to assimilate them wholly into the larger culture, and to strip them as a national policy of their Indian heritage. And so you're the expert on schools and so on. We took Indians away from their families against the wishes of their kin, and we took them to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, or Haskell, or other places. And when we got them there, we cut their hair, even though hair is a very important sacred business in Native cultures. We beat them, beat them severely if they used their native languages. We forced them to speak in English. We removed their native clothing and forced them to dress as white people. We forbade any Indian prayers of any sort and made them pray to our Christian God, and on and on and on. Our culture was 100% officially bent on stripping Indians of their Indianness. And so it doesn't surprise me then, if you're laying down grids, that you're not going to preserve things which you regard as pagan, backward, primitive, savage, things that might encourage Indians to cling to a culture that we've decided we're going to end. And even someone as thoughtful and generous as John Wesley Powell, who was one of the first great ethnologists of Native cultures in American life, Powell said we should force all Indians to change their names from Standing Bear or Jump in the Cloud to Jones and Smith, because if we allowed Indians to keep their metaphoric names, these lovely, colorful names, that this would somehow encourage them to continue being Indians, and that the only way they'd ever be accepted in the non-Indian world is if they became Smith and Jones and Stewart. And so here's one of the great enlightened ones of the 19th century wanting, in another way, to strip Indians of their Indianness. So it doesn't surprise me that our development patterns paid no attention to this. What surprises me is that we saved it.
Survived.
You go drive down there and you're right in the middle of Jefferson's grid, and it's section here, quarter section there, house, ranch. It just looks exactly like our development pattern, and then right in the heart of it is this little island that's owned by the state of North Dakota and protected against, the farmer could not go in there and plow that. He couldn't go in there and dynamite it. And so I like it that a few places have seemed important enough to us that even people of that intellectual or political bent have seen fit to save it.
Did you want to respond?
No.
Your statement, and just to emphasize what Clay just said, how could we not know? The issue then would have been we would not have cared. Could have known, but would not have cared, because that would have been counter to official U.S. policy. And I might add too, Clay mentioned Haskell and Carlisle as boarding schools. Maybe many of you know this, some might not. Frayne Barracks, the headquarters of our North Dakota National Guard just to the south of our campus, those buildings date back to when that was an Indian boarding school. So it happened not only in Carlisle and Haskell, it happened in Bismarck.
And in Wahpeton, and Louise Erdrich, our greatest living novelist, is a product of that school. But you know, you've done all this work on this world, Carol. What do you think that? And when I go to Native peoples now, like Scott Davis and David Gipp and others, and say, what are the sacred places in North Dakota? It gets into a long and interesting conversation about the nature of the sacred. But it is true that if you really wanted to inventory this, there's a light memory amongst Indians of specific places, at least a light memory that they're willing to tell to a complete stranger. In the Indian world, what's your sense of? I mean, if they had an internal inventory of sacred places, would there be a long list that we're simply not having access to?
Yeah. On the reservation, off the reservation, you can just drive with people and they'll start picking out places and telling you the stories and so on. So yeah, there's a long list of places and sacred sites, and still things go on there very quietly. People don't call a lot of attention to it. They don't get a lot of attention, and just go ahead and continue to take care of those sacred sites as well. So part of the issues too get to be that you have a lot of federal interference on the reservations. The reservations are essentially under a lot of federal controls and so on, not so much state controls, which is good too, but the tribe doesn't have a lot of control over many, many things that happen on the reservation, and those federal laws interfere a lot too.
Okay, we got more comments in back, please.
Cedric.
Lo mi taka be toka he ayuha chante was na bek chuzapo na mambli wo hookies a hemachapi na hunk papa makoche hemataha. I wanna first greet you all a warm, heartfelt handshake, and my name is Cedric Goodhouse, and I wanna there's so many things I've sit here, and there's so many things I want to say, but this rock you got up there, if you see how close the fence is to that rock, there's not much of our ceremony we can do if you understand what the ceremonies that go on. And the farmer or rancher that owns that land doesn't allow, sometimes he don't allow people to get up there to do the ceremonies. But even to go one step further back, you know, you say rock, why is this rock? But if you understand our creation story, real briefly, it goes like this. It says, before time, there was eon. Eon is our word for rock. Before time, there was Eon. And in order for there to be more, Eon had to share of Eon. So this is what Eon did. He spun in a great ball. Parts came off and the universe was created. You know. And as Eon shared more, his blood began to run and it turned blue. That's Miniwi Choni, water of life. And as Eon spun more, Eon's spirit, Wakantanka, left him and went up and created Makbia To, blue sky. So if I go on, you could start to understand why everything is sacred. Because as you walk in this world, they say walk in a sacred manner, you're walking on God every day. That's why it's important to understand this, you know. And the end of that story of our creation says that from all these things, we have our beginnings, everybody, you know. So we say, that's how we say Mitaki and Wasi, we're all related. So I wanted to just mention that real briefly, because I do see how in some instances what Carol talked about in her presentation about killing the Indian, saving a man, and that format that went on there, the assimilation process, you know, in some cases it worked. So you defer your questions now to those people, and yet those people need to defer to Lakota or Native American speaking people who know. So, you know, you need to, there's so many barriers you need to break down to get to that if you really want to do this. So I just wanted to say that because, you know, it's real important what you're talking about, because there was a treaty that was made in '68 that guaranteed all this land, the Missouri River all the way into Montana, the Yellowstone, the Bighorn Mountains down to Niobrara and back over to the Missouri. That was ours. And as you heard Carol's talk about, they just literally took that. And they've given all this money. And to understand how sacred it is to our tribes, to the Sioux people, to understand that monetary settlements in the billions, and we've never yet accepted that today, you know. So the concept of sacredness is also something we have to tackle, you know. So I just wanted to mention that because there's a lot of things that I wanted to. I feel like I was going to jump up a couple times, but I just wanted to say just those short things. Thank you.
Thank you.
Before you give up the microphone, though, I want to clarify something that you said, sir. First, I thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. But secondly, if I heard you correctly, you're saying that there's some disagreement among the Indian people on this issue as well, and some would be more traditionalists and some are not, and that you would want the government talking to the right group. Is that what I heard?
Well, that's your correctness. But what I said is that what Carol talked about, destroying the Indian and saving a man, or
right.
Mr. Jenkins said that, in some cases that has worked.
Okay.
And those are the people today that you are deferring your questions to. So, but those are the people, those people have to turn around and go ask what we would call the Ikchewichasha, the common people on a reservation, the people that speak, that know, and there's a lot that I guess can define those people too.
Okay.
But assimilation did work in some cases. You know, and like Carol said, you know, we can't get through the Fighting Sioux dialogue. But that's why, you know, it's okay for some and it's not okay for others.
Right, okay.
That you can, just real quick, but you can have somebody say, well, I sing Indian and I have feathers, but I'm okay with the Sioux. But then it's not those people, it's the ones that make the songs. It's the ones that do the ceremonies, you know.
Right, okay.
So you need to.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Did anybody want to respond? No? Okay. There's some more comments and questions?
Mine is a very particular one. As a youth, we used to make forays to a hill, both on foot and on our bicycles when we got them. And we often revered where we went to because we heard that it was a very special place, and I just wondered if you wanted to comment. I believe there's an understanding I have of the Mandan Hill, the Crying Hill, and the significance of that across the river.
Do you know?
Yeah, members of the Mandan Hidatsa tribe talk about that, and there's stories related to it and so on, where it was a sacred area. And again, it's one that I know Regina Shenandoah, who used to write a little column in the Mandan paper, talked about that sometimes and so on. And so it's, yeah, it looms in stories and so on.
Now that's, somebody help me, that's in private hands, right? The Mandan, the Crying Hill?
Mm-hmm.
It's in private hands?
Mm-hmm. I think they're going to develop real estate up there, or it's a good site for houses.
Okay. All right, any other questions?
Here's another one from this gentleman.
Another one down?
Robin, do you have?
Yep. This is Robin's aerobic day. And we appreciate it.
I don't know if you'd care to comment also on the sacred site of Young Man's Butte and the Crow warrior that is buried there and gave up his life. Is there, you know, medicinal significance to that area? I have heard that, and I have visited that site many times. And from that site, even without your binoculars, you can see the Killdeer Mountains, and you can also see as far south as Sully's Corral on the Heart River. But any comment about Young Man's Butte?
Well, there's a famous painting that Remington made based on it, that the crow was surrounded by Lakota, and he sang his heroic song knowing that he was to die there, and this became an iconic painting. It's right by Richardton. You can see it. It's a beautiful butte. I've spent the 4th of July there this year and climbed up it. You have to trespass. So that's what problem. The problem of access is a very serious problem. And often to get to places that either I personally regard as sacred, or as a culture we regard as sacred, or Native peoples would regard as sacred, you have to trespass. And you can go to the house and knock on the door, and you should. I tried, and there was no one home, so I just thought, I'll do it. So you go up there. There weren't any medicine bundles there. There wasn't any sense that Native peoples are spending much time up there. There were several white graves up there, which was very interesting, some recent, and little shrines that ranchers have put on top of the butte. It is an incredible butte, and you can see absolutely forever, in every direction from it. And it was a perfect way to spend the 4th of July. And it has a kind of a Bear Butte-like shape. It's an elongated butte. You can see it as you drive just east between Hebron and Richardton on the freeway. And it's one of, there was some work in Carroll. I'm guessing you know about this, but Ev Elbers was the director of the Humanities Council, and he was funding some work about sacred paleoastronomy, that there were a series of buttes on the Great Plains, Bear Butte, Bullion Butte, the Killdeer Mountains, and other buttes that coordinated to Lakota cosmology, and that it wasn't just places where Indians wanted to go to pray necessarily. There was a whole intricate network of buttes and sacredness and relating to the heavens.
Yeah. There's been some work done on that. Sinte Glishka
Right.
University in Rosebud, on the Rosebud Reservation has done some things. I know Cedric knows a lot more about that than I do, so I would defer if somebody wants to run a mic to him.
But there are some
Yeah,
suggestions that
there's, yeah, with Bear Butte and so on, that what's on Earth is reflected in the heavens, essentially, and that at certain times of the year with the positions of these, of the stars, then it's time for ceremonies and that sort of thing.
when things line up on
Yeah,
this butte, that there are, in a sense, constellations of buttes that reflect
Yeah.
constellations in the sky.
Yes.
Not white constellations, but native
Yes,
constellations.
yes.
Okay, we would have time for one more question if somebody had a here's a question down front here, Robin.
One more lap.
One more lap around the room. And
A lot of times sacred is also secret. You know, like the Aborigines in Australia, they don't want to tell you about these things. They're that sacred, they're also secret. And I'm wondering if categorizing and naming these places is yet another way of violating their sacredness.
There was something implicit in some of the things you were saying is that these matters are too sacred to be widely shared.
Yeah, I mean, people don't go out and advertise them, and there aren't signs on the Standing Rock Reservation for sure to point out sacred sites and so on, and there are those places. There's you know, a need to protect them. There still are areas where people will make vision quests and so on, and you want to isolate yourself, and you don't want people hiking up a hill right in the middle of a vision quest, something like that. And so, yeah, it's kind of not intended to keep totally secret, but just they're a need-to-know basis, I guess, something like that. Places like Devil's Tower and so on then have been appropriated, Wing Cave, all of those have been appropriated by National Park Service or state parks and so on, and they actually, some of their aura is that they were sacred sites to American Indian people, and now they're open to hiking and this and that and the other thing, and you might see Indians around the bottom or something, and medicine bundles and that sort of thing. So.
I had the chance a few years ago with Mike McCormick of the Bismarck State College staff to visit the area around Fort Yates with LaDonna Brave Bull Allard, and we were talking about Lewis and Clark, and you know, when Lewis and Clark came through, that area was Mandan land and Arikara land. Now it's Lakota land, but the Lakota have in a sense become protectors of sites that were not from their own culture. And so we were talking about Sacagawea, and Sacagawea almost certainly died at the age of 25 in December of 1812 at the mouth of the Grand River at a place called Fort Manuel. And so we'd had this wonderful day together, and we'd eaten, and we had prayed, and we had walked on the ground, and she had talked to us, and it was great because if we asked a silly or inappropriate question, she would say that it was silly or inappropriate, because we need to be taught how to ask questions, and it's very difficult to do. And eventually Mike said, "Do you know where Sacagawea is buried?" And she was quiet for a while, and then she said, "Well, two things. Yes, I do, and I'm not telling you." And then she said, "And if I told you, we'd have to kill you." But she said, "We know things that we're never going to tell you, so just deal with that.
Yeah.
But your curiosity is valid, but our refusal to comply with that curiosity is valid too." I thought that was a wonderful thing.
Dr. Barrett, thank you so much for being
Thank you.
here. Thank you, all of you. Appreciate it. Appreciate it.